He who follows another will never overtake him. Montaigne.
There is a peculiar silence that follows the departure of a giant. It is not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of absence. An emptiness so profound that every sound, every movement afterward feels diminished. History, politics, business, art, all have witnessed this silence. It is the stage left bare after the lead actor has exited, the throne vacated by a ruler whose very presence defined an age, the company whose visionary founder steps down and leaves behind a myth larger than any quarterly report. Into that silence inevitably comes the successor. And with them comes the impossible task, not simply to lead, but to prove they are not lesser than the legend who came before. Consider the figure of a new president stepping into office after a man who has defined an era. The banners still hang, the slogans still echo, and the people measure every word, every gesture against the memory of the predecessor. No matter what the newcomer says, it is received as a pale reflection, an imitation. The press does not ask, what is he building, but rather, how does he compare? It is not his own record that is written, but his failures to live up to a ghost. The office itself seems to whisper, you are not him. Or take the painter who emerges in the wake of a master. However skilled, however innovative, the first brushstroke on the canvas is not seen as his own, but as an echo of another hand. Critics label him the new Caravaggio or the next Picasso, never granting him the dignity of originality. His art may be striking, his vision sincere, yet history has already consigned him to a role he did not choose, that of the shadow, not the light. This is the essence of inheritance, to gain the throne, the canvas, the company, but to find that the seat itself is poisoned. The human mind is not generous when it comes to comparison. It clings to the extraordinary, exaggerates it, mythologizes it, and then places it as the standard by which all successors are judged. The larger the legend, the narrower the space left for those who follow. We tell ourselves that inheriting greatness is a blessing. A child is born into a dynasty, a general is named as heir to a conqueror, a student rises after a teacher. But hidden in this blessing is the cruelest curse. The name of the predecessor becomes a chain binding every decision, every act. Should the successor try to imitate, he looks like a fraud. Should he try to innovate, he is accused of betraying tradition. The path forward narrows until it becomes no path at all. The silence that follows greatness is not empty, it is filled with echoes. And echoes are dangerous because they create the illusion of presence. The crowd hears not your voice, but the one before you. They see not your step, but the imprint of another's foot. And in that illusion you vanish. History is not merciful in these cases. It remembers the giant and it forgets the man who came after. For every Alexander there are 10 successors who tore each other apart in futile attempts to be him. For every Augustus there is a Tiberius whose name is muttered in tones of disappointment. For every Henry there is an heir who struggles against a legend of power and desire. This is why stepping into a great man's shoes is not simply difficult, it is fatal. The shoes are too large, the footprints too deep, the myth too enduring. To step inside them is to disappear into someone else's story, and once you vanish there, the world will never see you again. Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes is not merely advice for monarchs or emperors. It is a universal principle of power, ambition, and survival. At its heart lies a paradox. What looks like fortune, inheriting a throne, a business, or a legacy, is often a curse disguised as opportunity. To step directly into the space once occupied by greatness is to invite comparison to a standard that no human being can match. Robert Greene warns us that history does not judge successors kindly. The one who follows a giant is rarely remembered for his own actions. Instead, his name is permanently tied to the one who came before, and almost always unfavorably. The more beloved, feared, or admired the predecessor, the more suffocating their shadow becomes. This is why Greene tells us, never step into those shoes if you can avoid it, for they will not carry you forward, they will trap you in place. The logic is simple but brutal. Human beings are wired to remember extremes, not averages. We remember Alexander the Great, not the administrators who managed his empire. We remember Augustus, not the careful senators who maintained the machinery of Rome. We remember Henry VIII, not the minor kings who struggled in his wake. The extraordinary overshadows the ordinary, and myth magnifies memory. When you follow directly after a legend, you are not measured by your own deeds, but against an ideal that has been polished by time, myth, and nostalgia into something untouchable. Psychology intensifies the danger. The crowd, the nation, the shareholders, even family members cling to what they already know. They project onto you the traits of the one who came before. If you act differently, you are condemned as weak, as a betrayer of tradition. If you act the same, you are dismissed as a poor imitation. Every gesture is interpreted through a lens that is not your own. You are not free to define yourself because your identity has already been pre-written by comparison. Strategically, this law exposes the false promise of succession. To inherit greatness is not to possess it. The Roman Empire did not need another Augustus. It needed stability, continuity, and order. But Tiberius could never be seen as anything other than not Augustus. Microsoft did not need another Gates. It needed a leader to redefine its future. Yet Ballmer could never escape the image of being the man who lacked Gates's vision. The world does not judge successors fairly. It judges them cruelly because it remembers the myth more vividly than it perceives the present. This is why Law 41 commands avoidance. If you can, never take the throne immediately after the great man. Let another stand in that impossible space and collapse under the weight of comparison. Let the public grow disillusioned. Let the myth fade. Let nostalgia cool. Only then, when the shadow is thinned, should you step forward. By that time, you will not be seen as a replacement, but as a revival. But if circumstance forces you into that position, imitation will destroy you. You must instead redefine the narrative. You cannot be the second Alexander, the second Augustus, the second Henry. You must be something else entirely. A new myth, a new identity, a new story. Elizabeth did not try to be her father, Henry VIII, or her sister Mary. She became the Virgin Queen, a figure of her own invention. She did not step into their shoes, she burned them and walked barefoot onto new ground. The lesson is merciless but liberating. Power does not reward preservation, it rewards creation. The shoes of the great man are a trap. They promise stability, inheritance, and glory, but they deliver comparison, suffocation, and eventual ruin. To obey this law is to understand that greatness cannot be borrowed. It must be made anew. Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes tells us if you inherit power, do not imitate. If you inherit wealth, do not guard it timidly. If you inherit a name, do not live in its shadow. Either let the myth fade before you act, or create your own myth so strong that the old one crumbles beside it. Anything less, and you will not be remembered as yourself, but only as the pale reflection of someone else. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, the world held its breath. He was only 32 years old, yet he had carved an empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt, from the heart of Asia Minor to the edges of India. His name was already legend, his victories the stuff of myth, his charisma binding together peoples who otherwise had no reason to share loyalty. His death was not only the end of a life, it was the sudden removal of the keystone in an arch so immense that no one else could hold it together. What remained was a vacuum. Alexander left no clear heir. His half-brother Aridaeus was mentally unfit to rule, his son Alexander IV not yet born at the time of his death. Into this vacuum stepped his most trusted generals, men hardened by campaigns, men who had ridden with him across deserts and mountains. They were known as the Diadochi, the successors. Each of them had tasted command, each had ambition, and each believed himself closest to Alexander's vision. But none of them were Alexander. At first they tried to hold the empire together in the name of continuity. Regents were appointed, territories divided for administration. Yet the cracks were immediate. The problem was not simply political but psychological. Each of these men, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Cassander, Lysimachus, measured himself not against one another but against the absent Alexander. In their hearts they believed they could step into his shoes, extend his glory, wear his crown. But the shoes of Alexander were not shoes at all. They were myths, and myths cannot be inherited. The wars of the Diadochi soon consumed the empire. Instead of stability, the years after Alexander's death were marked by betrayal, shifting alliances, assassinations, and endless campaigns. Ptolemy seized Egypt and made it his dynasty. Seleucus carved out Asia. Antigonus sought to reunify everything and nearly succeeded but was crushed. Cassander claimed Macedonia, exterminating Alexander's heirs in a ruthless bid to erase the bloodline. Each man tried not only to rule but to be seen as the rightful continuation of Alexander himself. And in that attempt lay their downfall. For none could replicate Alexander's charisma. He was not merely a general, he was a living symbol, a bridge between East and West, a man believed to have divine favor. His soldiers had followed him not out of obligation but out of awe. His name itself carried momentum, the sense that destiny was unfolding through him. The successors lacked this aura. They had strength but not the myth. They had armies but not loyalty born of reverence. And so their attempts to fill his shoes rang hollow. What followed was fragmentation. Instead of a single empire, there emerged competing kingdoms locked in perpetual rivalry. The dream of Alexander, one world united under a single vision, died with him. His successors inherited not greatness but comparison. They could not surpass him. They could not even match him. And their failure was written not in small mistakes but in the blood of thousands across decades of futile war. History remembers Alexander. His name is carved into the foundation of Western and Eastern traditions alike. His image was stamped on coins centuries after his death, his legend retold by Romans, Persians, and beyond. The Diadochi, by contrast, are remembered only as fragments, as footnotes to his story. Ptolemy is recalled because his line gave us Cleopatra, Seleucus because his dynasty shaped parts of Asia, but the rest dissolve into the haze of forgotten wars. They stepped directly into Alexander's shoes and disappeared inside them. The lesson is sharp. To inherit the mantle of a giant is not to become great, but to be consumed by the weight of his myth. The Diadochi were powerful men in their own right, but they chose the wrong path. Instead of carving new identities, they attempted to live as continuations of Alexander. In doing so, they bound themselves to a comparison they could never win. In the end, Alexander's empire collapsed not because it was ungovernable, but because those who followed him tried to be him rather than themselves. And history, merciless as ever, erased their ambitions and preserved only the name of the man they could not replace. When Augustus died in the year 14 CE, Rome mourned not merely an emperor but the architect of an entire world. He had taken a crumbling republic torn apart by civil wars and assassinations, and through patience, cunning, and unmatched political genius, transformed it into an empire that would endure for centuries. Augustus was not remembered only for victories on the battlefield, but for his ability to weave stability out of chaos, to present absolute power in the gentle cloak of tradition, to dominate without appearing to dominate. He was, in every sense, a great man. His shoes were not shoes at all. They were monuments. For nearly half a century, Augustus had defined Rome's destiny. He had lived long enough that his reign became the only reality the Roman people knew. Generations had been born and raised under his leadership. To them, Augustus was not simply an emperor, but the very embodiment of Rome's glory. The city and the man were inseparable. Whoever followed him would inherit not merely a throne, but the unbearable burden of comparison to a living legend. That man was Tiberius. Tiberius was no fool, no weakling. He was a capable general and administrator with discipline and intellect. He had led campaigns in Germania and the Balkans. He had the bloodline of the Julio-Claudians, and Augustus himself had, after much hesitation, adopted him as heir. On paper, he was more than qualified. Yet from the very beginning, his reign was haunted by the shadow of his predecessor. The Senate and people of Rome, accustomed to Augustus's charisma and careful balance of power, looked to Tiberius with suspicion. Where Augustus had been gracious, Tiberius was stern. Where Augustus had charmed, Tiberius commanded. His natural reserve was mistaken for arrogance. His caution was read as timidity. Every action, every decree, every word spoken in the Forum was measured not on its own merit but against the memory of Augustus. Even successes brought him no glory. Victories in the provinces were dismissed as routine, for Augustus had done greater. Administrative reforms were ignored, for Augustus had restructured Rome itself. The more Tiberius ruled, the more he seemed a pale shadow of the man who had come before. In the eyes of Rome, he was not truly emperor. He was not Augustus. This weight drove Tiberius inward. Unable to win the affection of the people, he turned bitter and suspicious. His reign became increasingly marked by paranoia. Treason trials multiplied. Senators feared whispers could cost them their lives. Eventually, he withdrew altogether to the island of Capri, ruling Rome at a distance, consumed by distrust and resentment. The once capable general was remembered as a recluse, a tyrant who presided over fear rather than glory. It is telling how history recorded him. Augustus is celebrated as the founder of the Roman Empire, the man who gave Rome its golden age. Tiberius, though he maintained the empire's stability and left it secure upon his death, is remembered as gloomy, cruel, and unloved. His accomplishments, and there were many, are eclipsed by the singular fact that he could never escape the comparison. He stepped into the shoes of Augustus, and those shoes swallowed him whole. The lesson here is not that Tiberius lacked ability, but that ability is irrelevant when trapped inside another man's myth. No matter how disciplined, no matter how shrewd, he was doomed from the moment he accepted the throne directly after Augustus. The Roman people did not want another ruler. They wanted Augustus back. And because Tiberius was not Augustus, he was despised, feared, and eventually discarded in memory as a cautionary tale rather than celebrated as a sovereign. This is the cruelty of Law 41. It shows how even competence cannot withstand comparison to greatness. Tiberius's fate was sealed not by his failures but by his position. To inherit the throne of Augustus was not an opportunity. It was a sentence. And like the diadochi before him, he discovered too late that stepping into a great man's shoes does not elevate you. It crushes you beneath the weight of their shadow. When Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne in 1558, she did so under the most perilous of shadows. She was the daughter of Henry VIII, a king whose larger-than-life presence had dominated England for nearly 4 decades. Henry was remembered for his willpower, his brutal decisiveness, his break with Rome, and his creation of a national church. To the people, Henry was not merely a monarch but a storm, destructive, unpredictable, but undeniably powerful. To follow him was to walk in the wake of a force of nature. But Elizabeth did not inherit the throne directly from Henry. Instead, she stood in the ruins left by her half-sister, Mary I. Mary had tried to resurrect Catholicism with fire and sword, burning Protestants at the stake, earning her the grim nickname Bloody Mary. Her reign was brief, but its violence scarred the realm. England was divided, exhausted, suspicious of its rulers, and burdened by the memory of a father who had embodied power and a sister who had embodied terror. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom fractured in soul and vulnerable in body. The great man's shoes, her father's, were too large. The immediate shadow, her sister's, was too dark. By all logic, she should have been crushed. She was a young woman in a man's world, surrounded by doubters who saw her gender as weakness, her legitimacy as questionable, and her prospects as poor. Yet what Elizabeth understood, and what makes her story the reversal in this law, is that the only way to survive such inheritance was not to fill the shoes at all. It was to create new ones. From the very beginning, Elizabeth refused imitation. She did not try to be Henry reborn, nor did she continue Mary's path. Instead, she crafted an image entirely her own, one that the people could not compare to her father or sister because it was unlike either. She became the Virgin Queen, a sovereign who married not a man but her nation. By elevating her singleness into a myth, she transformed what others saw as vulnerability into a source of strength. No longer was she judged as a daughter or a sister. She became something else, a symbol, a figure larger than life, unbound by comparison. Her reign was marked by careful strategy. She played rivals against one another, never overcommitting, always maintaining ambiguity. She courted Spain and France when it suited her, then defied them when the moment required. She surrounded herself with skilled ministers but ensured none became indispensable. Through patience and cunning, she turned England into a power capable of defeating the Spanish Armada in 1588, an achievement that elevated her from monarch to legend. But perhaps her greatest triumph was psychological. Elizabeth understood the danger of being defined by her predecessors. So she defined herself. Portraits depicted her in symbolic imagery, untouched by time, radiant in white and gold, surrounded by celestial motifs. She was not Henry's daughter, not Mary's sister, but Gloriana, Astria, Britannia, mythic names that placed her beyond mere mortal rulers. She wove her own legend so tightly that even her enemies were forced to acknowledge her as unique. In doing so, Elizabeth escaped the trap of Law 41. She did not step into her father's shoes, nor did she stumble in her sister's. She created her own path, one so different that comparison became impossible. Where Henry had been remembered for his brutality and Mary for her cruelty, Elizabeth was remembered for stability, prosperity, and the flowering of English culture. The Elizabethan age became its own golden age, inseparable from her name. History confirms the success of her strategy. Henry VIII is remembered as powerful but tyrannical. Mary I as tragic and feared. Elizabeth, by contrast, endures as one of the most celebrated monarchs in history. She proved that the only way to inherit greatness is to refuse its terms. She did not accept the poisoned gift of succession on its own terms. She redefined it, turned it to her advantage, and in doing so ensured that her own legend would outshine those of the figures who had threatened to overshadow her. The reversal of Law 41 is rare, but Elizabeth demonstrates it. To follow giants without being destroyed, you must refuse to walk in their footprints. You must redraw the map, redefine the role, invent an identity so original that the old comparisons fall away. Only then can you inherit without being consumed. The stories of Alexander's successors, Tiberius and Elizabeth, reveal a truth that is uncomfortable, but inescapable. Power is not only about what you do, but about the story others tell about you. And stories are never told in isolation. They are told against the backdrop of memory, myth, and comparison. To inherit power directly from a figure who has become myth is to enter a story that is not your own, and to be judged by standards you can never control. This is the heart of Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. Greatness creates distortion. It bends perception so that what follows it appears diminished, no matter how capable or accomplished. The world remembers extremes, not continuity. Alexander is remembered, his generals are forgotten. Augustus is remembered, Tiberius is reduced to a bitter shadow. Henry VIII is remembered for his thunderous reign. Elizabeth survives not by echoing him, but by breaking free from the comparison entirely. Psychologically, this law draws its force from the human tendency toward anchoring and contrast. Once a figure has established a standard of greatness, our minds fixate on that point as the anchor. Anyone who follows is inevitably compared to it. If the successor achieves less, he is condemned. If he achieves the same, it seems unremarkable because it was already done. Even if he achieves more, the world often refuses to recognize it because the narrative has already been shaped. The successor is always seen through the lens of the one who came before. Strategically, this creates one of the most dangerous illusions in power, the belief that succession is security. A son inherits his father's throne, a general inherits his king's army, a CEO inherits a founder's company. To the outsider, this seems like fortune, but to the strategist, it is a trap. Succession binds you to continuity, and continuity traps you in comparison. Unless you find a way to redefine the role entirely, you will be remembered not as yourself, but as the failure to live up to another. There are broadly three paths when confronted with such a legacy. Avoidance. The cleanest solution is to refuse the poisoned gift. If a great man departs, let another step into the vacuum first. Let them struggle with impossible expectations. Let them disappoint. Let them soften the myth through failure. By the time you arrive, the legend will have faded, and you can stand as a savior rather than a shadow. Delay and distancing. If avoidance is impossible, create time or space between yourself and the predecessor. Do not immediately assume their role in its current form. Reshape it. Change the narrative. If you inherit a company, pivot its mission before you are judged on the old one. If you inherit a throne, emphasize a new era, new values, new myths. Never present yourself as the next, but always as the new. Radical reinvention. If avoidance and delay are denied to you, then reinvention is your only weapon. You must redefine yourself so thoroughly that comparison becomes meaningless. Elizabeth I did not inherit her father's shoes. She created her own. She refused to marry, turned her gender into a mythic symbol, and recast her rule as something utterly distinct. She was no longer measured against Henry or Mary because she was not playing their game. She had built her own. Those who fail to follow these paths are not always failures in ability, but they become failures in perception. Tiberius ruled effectively in many respects. The empire remained intact, revenues stable, the army loyal. But history does not remember stability, it remembers myth. Because Tiberius never escaped the comparison to Augustus, his name is marked by gloom, not glory. The deeper trap lies in the illusion of continuity. People believe they want the successor to maintain the predecessor's greatness. In truth, they want the predecessor back. And since that is impossible, they will never be satisfied. The successor is condemned before he even begins. This is why so many powerful men and women stumble when they step directly into a great man's shoes. They think they have inherited strength, but what they have inherited is resentment, nostalgia, and comparison. To master this law is to recognize that greatness cannot be borrowed. Titles, thrones, companies, and reputations can be handed down, but aura, charisma, and myth cannot. They must be forged anew. The strategist must therefore resist the seduction of inheritance. What looks like a shortcut to glory is often the fastest path to obscurity. The power player must learn instead to write a new script. If you inherit, transform. If you succeed, delay. If you are compared, reframe. The key is to destroy the frame of reference that ties you to the predecessor. Until you do that, you are not yourself. You are merely a measurement of someone else. Law 41, then, is not only a warning, but a challenge. It dares you to resist the comfort of ready-made power, to refuse the poisoned crown, to create something that is yours alone. To step into a great man's shoes is to vanish into his shadow. To carve your own path is to force history to remember your name, not as an echo but as a voice that stands on its own. History has little mercy for the successor. It etches the name of the giant into stone and lets the one who follows fade into dust. The empire of Alexander lives in memory not because of the Diadochi who ruled after him, but because he himself seemed destined to stand larger than life. Rome's golden age is tied to Augustus, not to the man who quietly preserved his work. And yet the Elizabethan age belongs to Elizabeth alone, because she understood that to inherit without invention is death. The law does not tell us to fear greatness. It tells us to fear its shadow. To step into that shadow without thought is to smother your own fire before it has even burned. Every successor must ask, am I walking into another man's footprints or am I leaving my own? The silence that follows greatness is always dangerous, for in that silence echoes remain. They whisper comparisons, they chain you to nostalgia, they remind the world of what was and make it blind to what is. If you are not careful, those whispers will become the only thing people hear when they look at you. And when they do, you are no longer yourself. You are the ghost of someone else's legend. So learn from history. If you must inherit, do not imitate. If you must follow, do not copy. Create your own myth or step aside and let another exhaust themselves in the shadow before you emerge. Power remembers creators, not imitators. Alexander's generals fought for his throne, and we barely recall their names. Tiberius ruled an empire securely, and yet he is remembered with disdain. Elizabeth defied the weight of her father and sister, and in doing so carved an age that still bears her name. The lesson is merciless but clear. Greatness cannot be worn like a garment. It must be woven anew. And so Law 41 speaks to us across time. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. Do not let your life be measured as a shadow of another's glory. Step aside, wait, redefine, or reinvent, but never walk in the footprints of giants. For footprints lead only to the past, and power belongs to those who claim the future. Like, subscribe, comment, or don't. You are the master of your own life.